Hello and welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. One of the lovely things about running this channel, and honestly there are so many, is that every now and again I receive wonderful gifts from viewers. One such gift is this stunning Oldhammer miniature from the Citadel Miniatures range, which was sent in by Robert Druery. Robert wanted nothing in return for this, but did say I could give his friend's Facebook page Fried Designs a shout out. Fried Designs do t-shirts, 3D prints and commissioned art, and you can check them out using the link that you will find in the video description below. But what is this miniature? It's a dwarf, but no ordinary dwarf. This is a dwarf of legendary stature, far exceeding his physical height. This is the White Dwarf Grombrindal. To be more specific, this is the 2002 White Dwarf miniature, issued in celebration of the 100th edition of the French language White Dwarf magazine. He's holding his little croissant helmet, which is full of beer. So I wanted to paint this little guy up, and I thought while I was doing that, we could take a brief look at the history of the White Dwarf, and to a lesser extent, White Dwarf, and we can run through all of Grombrindal's iterations and incarnations over the years. White Dwarf magazine dates back to February 1975, when Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone started publishing a newsletter called Owl and Weasel. This newsletter would eventually evolve into the White Dwarf magazine, so named because it evoked both the themes of science fiction and fantasy. Issue 1 of White Dwarf had the publication date of June-July 1977. The White Dwarf, the magazine's mascot, doesn't appear on the cover of that issue, but you can find him hanging out on the contents page looking suitably stoic. However, at this time he wasn't known as Grombrindal, the epic badass of Dwarven legends, as depicted here on the front cover of the White Dwarf Apocrypha from 2019. In fact, if we look inside the Apocrypha and refer to the different typefaces of the White Dwarf logo through the years, he didn't appear on the cover of the magazine until the logo was revised for the first time, and that was issue 39, March 1983. And by then, he had already been immortalised as a tabletop miniature. In 1979, Games Workshop and Brian Ansell announced they were forming a company called Citadel Miniatures. Well, according to an article on the Warhammer community website, shortly after that formation, they created the first White Dwarf miniature. A lovely simple piece, not the show-offy dwarf we would come to know and love. The Warhammer community article goes on to say that there were White Dwarf miniatures released in 1984 and 1987, but photos are lost to history. I have to assume that the Warhammer team don't have great Google foo, because I found both miniatures in the time it took the kettle to boil. The 1984 miniature was part of Speciality Set SS6, released in February 1984. I found the image on the always useful treasure trove that is the Stuff of Legends website. I will link to it in the video description because if you have any interest in Oldhammer, you need to see it. It's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, the Speciality Set brought to life characters from White Dwarf, such as the barbarian Thrud, who starred in his own comic strip, or Livingstone the Head Hitter, the Editor, get it? And of course, there was the White Dwarf himself. He doesn't look too different to the previous version, but he swapped the axe to his left side to reflect the mascot that still featured on the magazine cover at this time. 1987 is when it gets really interesting, and where HeroQuest fans will prick their ears up, because in June 1987, White Dwarf magazine celebrated its 10th anniversary, and the front cover featured what will be, to old school HeroQuest players, a very familiar dwarf. This glorious painting of the White Dwarf is the work of John Sibbick, and it was the basis for not one, but two miniatures. The first one was a special figure sculpted by the Perry twins that you could order for the princely sum of 60p if you ordered anything else from the mail order trolls. As for the second miniature, that is part of one of the best and most insidious pieces of advertising subterfuge in the history of board games. In November 1988, the White Dwarf logo changed, and the silhouetted White Dwarf mascot was replaced with Sibbick's version. And then, in 1989, HeroQuest hit the market, and lo and behold, the dwarf hero was the White Dwarf. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be, but Sibbick's art was used for the character board and the miniature was clearly based on it. And so, every time you set up your game of HeroQuest, you were being bombarded with visions of none other than Grombrindal. Of course, he wasn't called Grombrindal then, he was still very much a symbol rather than a fleshed out character. But that would change in August 1996. Sibic's version of the White Dwarf appeared for the last time as the White Dwarf logo in October 1995 for issue 190. For issue 191, he was replaced by a snarling white-haired dwarf that looked like he was punching his way through the page, a manifestation that continued until, I believe, issue 231. This was the first hint of things to come. Then, when White Dwarf celebrated its 200th issue in August 1996, the magazine cover featured a piece of art by Wayne England that was very much on brand for the slightly garish and cartoonish style that Games Workshop was leaning into. It was the White Dwarf from the redesigned logo. It was Grombrindal. Finally, the White Dwarf had a name and a legend was born. Naturally, a special miniature was made to celebrate this occasion, and I think it's a pretty good one. We then have to fast forward 6 years for our next incarnation of Grombrindal, and this one is indeed our French friend from 2002. This is a really lovely miniature. And here's mine, all painted up using a mix of Citadel washes and P3 paints. This was a really quick miniature to finish, it's almost 90% hair. And for that hair, I did a base coat of P3 Frostbite, which is a really lovely pale light blue. Then I did a wash of thinned down Nuln Oil, followed by a dry brush of Frostbite, and then a final highlight of P3 Marrow White. And I'm really happy with how it turned out. Incidentally, this is the first time I've had to paint beer. For that I used P3 Menoth White, which is a yellowy white colour, and then I did progressive highlights adding Marrow White to the Menoth White before doing a final top highlight using pure Marrow White. I'm not necessarily sure it looks like a frothy pint, but it will do. It was a while until we would get another miniature, but for White Dwarf 300 in December 2004, we did get a beautiful comic recounting the legend of the White Dwarf. It was written by Gordon Rennie with art by Carl Richardson. I don't have the original issue it appeared in, but it was reprinted in the Apocrypha. The next White Dwarf miniature was in 2007, and this one was iconic, a beautiful piece showing the White Dwarf held aloft by Gotrek and Bugman. Quite touching in its way, and a fabulous collectible. This miniature also marked the beginning of a stint of annual releases for the White Dwarf. The next was in 2008. It doesn't feature in the Warhammer community article because I guess the intern was in a rush, but it was a free gift for subscribing to White Dwarf magazine. I found the image on Stuff of Legends. Seriously, go and check them out. Sadly, this for me marks the last White Dwarf miniature that I find interesting. Most of the rest are gimmick pieces. In 2009 we got Space Grombrindal, just to annoy the people who wanted squats to make a comeback. In 2010, Grombrindal became a pilot. I am sure there was a reason for that, I didn't bother trying to figure it out. In 2011, he became a pirate. This one is not so bad because, you know, pirates. In 2012, he tried his hand at becoming a movie director, and then in 2013, he became a vampire hunter, straddling a coffin while the resident tried to nip out for a bite. The next incarnation of the White Dwarf belongs in the Book of Grudges. It came out in 2016, and it's basically a repack of an existing Trollslayer miniature. Considering this was supposed to be a celebration of White Dwarf returning to a monthly publication after an ill-advised attempt to move to a weekly format, this can only be seen as a disappointment. I actually do have this miniature, but only because White Dwarf published rules for using this version of Grombrindal in Silver Tower. In 2017, White Dwarf celebrated its 40th anniversary, and to celebrate, they combined their two most iconic poster boys, Grombrindal and Space Marines. He's enjoying some Bugman's Ale while opening presents, and there's a goblin in a cake. It's nonsense. In 2018, he was back as a Blood Bowl player with the most absurd hair imaginable. And then, in 2019, he was a tech priest, because I guess why not? And then finally, in 2024, in celebration of the 500th edition of White Dwarf magazine, we got a special celebration miniature. Something of a return to form, and a nice way to end the list. Who knows what the White Dwarf will be up to next? I know what my White Dwarf will be up to. He's painted and ready for adventure. I just need some kind of quest to send him on. A nice quest in the Warhammer setting. Some kind of Warhammer quest. But that is it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really like the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.